All right. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for coming out to this Archgen Workshop. The first point of business here is the pronunciation. It's Archgen. It's a hard K. It's not arch. That's because this tool deals with archetypes, which is basically a fancy word for templates. So the first real item of business is to talk about what is this tool? What is Archgen? So Archgen is a code generation tool. So there's a bunch of other code generation tools and options out there. There's the Yeoman generator. There's a bunch of things. If you're using Visual Studio or .NET, anything like that, you can always, there's a bunch of like .NET create blank app commands that will create a blank application, or something that will generate a controller and a service and just a bunch of code for you. I'm going to use Yeoman as an example. I know some of you in here are students that I had previously, and we used the Yeoman generator in that class. And what that did was you could put in a few variables, and in that instance it was just the name of the application. And then you would create it, and it would generate some code for you. And it was basically the same thing as a copy-paste. It was the same code you were getting every single time, just it switched out. There's basically like insert name here, or insert this variable here, and it's just text. It's just changing text out for other text. What Archgen does that is different is it generates code based on a descriptor file that you feed to it. And we'll go over in more depth what that file looks like. But essentially inside that file, you can use JSON and just describe what you want your project to be like, the different pieces of data in your project, the different entities, and it will build the code. It will generate code based on what you describe there. So it's dynamic. It doesn't just put variables here and there. It will build a whole data flow path for each entity you define, and then each entity has different properties on it that it will do things for. So it's a lot more dynamic than just kind of a copy paste, insert this text here, here, and here. So before we get started looking into how this works, today we're going to go over, we're going to do three things essentially. We're going to install Archgen. We're going to learn how to use Archgen to generate code. And then we're going to learn how to create a custom archetype. And that is, like I said, archetype is just a fancy word for template. The template is what the descriptor gets ran against to generate code. So installing, generating code with already existing archetypes, and then creating custom archetypes that you can use to generate code off of for future use. So that's what we're going to be covering tonight. So first off, to install, open up your terminal command prompt, whatever CLI you're using, and you can run npm install-g archgen. I'll go ahead and run it, even though I already got it. And you should get Archgen 0.1.7. And then go ahead and create a project folder somewhere. We're going to create a new project here. So I'm going to just call mine test2. And then open it in whatever text editor you're going to use, or IDE. I'm going to go ahead and use VS Code. So when you install Archgen, it comes with a few different archetypes by default. The ones that I have on there. Part of the ability to create your own archetypes is it can grow and you can have more options. This is an open source project. Frank has contributed greatly to that. It's been much appreciated. And so that's also something, if you guys want to contribute to this at any point, open a pull request, feel free to do that. It's a good way to get some experience in open source and contributing to that. And actually, I forgot one thing before we actually start this project. If everyone can open up your browser and go to github.com/nicksuin/archgen. Go there real quick. I'll give everyone a minute to get there.
So can you repeat the part where you said about the things? Because I wasn't there.
The part where I said about the things. Okay. All right. All right. Is everyone here?
That was the next thing?
Raise your hand if you're on this page right now. Good. All right. Everyone see this button right up here in the corner that says star? Can everyone please go ahead and click that button? I'm serious. Go ahead and click it. Just you guys will be some of the first. This is a new tool. It is actually super useful. If you take this, when you go into your employment, your jobs, you'll be able to use this to help out. So it's pretty cool. I'm going to refresh, and I'm going to make sure everyone's clicked it now. All right, there we go. So
we can start later.
I mean, I know how many people are online and how many people are in this classroom, so we're not quite there yet. But I'll give it one more refresh and see what we've got, and then I'll move on. All right, that's better. No, don't click it again. Only click it once. Only click it once. If it says unstar, you're good. If it says star, click it.
What would happen is you would no longer
Yes, you want to be an unstar. Yes. Perfect. All right, back to the editor. We're gonna move on to the real stuff now. So I'm going to create a file called descriptor.json. Now, in order for this to work, you have to have this file, the descriptor.json file. So we pull this over. Now, what our descriptor is going to do is it's going to describe what the project is going to look like. Now, each archetype has its own values that can be used for it, and so you can always look at, let's take a look at, I'm going to use this one. This is the mean TS archetype, and here's the README file for it, and it gives an example of the descriptor.json. So this one has name, connection, and entities. Entities is an array, and then each entity has name and props. Props is an array of properties. Now, if you look at this, ignore the comments in there. It makes it kind of hard to see. But this is like a class. Each entity essentially is a class, and it becomes a class. So if you've built the data flow all the way through in any of the languages, you'll have a controller. Usually you have a service layer. You have some kind of data access layer. You have a model or an entity. And that's basically what these entities are. It describes the entity. So for example, if I had a user entity, it might have a user ID, username, last login date, password, just everything that describes that. Now the data flow, you'll hear me say that a lot, the data flow or the data flow path, that's essentially, if I'm on the front end, I send a request to my back end, and that, if it's MVC, you're going to catch that at the controller, go to a service layer of some sort, data access layer, pass it all the way back. That's the data flow I'm talking about. And that data flow has to exist for each entity for you to pass it back and forth. And that's where the power of Archgen is going to come in at. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this to start. Actually, no, I'm not going to copy. I'll just go ahead and do it from here. One last note before I start typing it in. Almost all, now they can be different, but for the most part, they're all going to have name and they're all going to have entities. Those are really the core pieces of each archetype. You can make your own custom archetypes. It might not have those, but you'll see when we start creating custom archetypes why entities is so important. So I'm going to go ahead for this one. I have to give it a name. And I will call this one test app. And then we're going to give it a connection. And I'll go ahead and post. I've got a connection string. Everyone can use the same connection string if you're following along. Let me grab that connection string real quick. And I will post it in Slack.
There's better not to follow along.
Yeah, you don't have to follow. Actually, is anyone following along? Yeah? Okay.
Question is I didn't catch. Was the name of that file an important name? Is that the?
Yes, it is important. It is descriptor.json. It has to be that. Again, this is being recorded, so you can always go back and watch it. So if you're following along and you fall behind at all, just don't try to catch up. Just stop and listen. Conceptually, it's better to grasp it there and then go back and watch it. For now, I will go ahead and post this in the general Slack channel. And I'll put the user there and the password. There we go. It's not an important database, so I'm not worried that you guys have the information for it. So let's go ahead. Now that I've got that, I'm going to paste that in my connection string here. And then I can create my entities, which is, like I said, one of the most important parts of this. It's an array. Go ahead and array of object literals. Now each entity, if I come back and look at my archetype here, I can see each one has name and props. So I'm going to go ahead. I'll give this one the name, and I will call this one user. And props, another array. Each prop, as you can see here, has a name and a type. If you think about when you're declaring a variable in any statically or strongly typed language, you have the name of the variable and the type of the variable. That's essentially what this is right here. So, for example, I'm going to have username. So the name of this will be username, and the type will be a string. Now I can go ahead and copy and paste this here to add another property. Let's go password, and that's going to be a string. And I'll just leave those two properties there for now. Now I'm going to add another entity, so I'll just go ahead and copy this whole entity right there. Now for each entity I create, that is going to create another instance of that data flow path. So if I have 3 entities created, it will create that data flow for 3 different entities. And you can have, like I said, any number of props, any number of entities, so it's different for each entity, but the data flow is the same. So the value comes in, well, it saves you a lot of work right there, and you'll see once it generates. But if I add 20 entities, because there are a lot of requests that need to be made, that's where a lot of value is seen, because instead of writing that code 20 times, very similar, it's different because it's different for each entity, but it's the same pattern. The value comes in the more you add. So I'm going to go ahead and, let's say, post. Post is going to have content. That's going to be a string. I'll give it a title, which will be a string. And we'll give it created on. I'll leave that as a string for now. Oops. And lastly, I'm going to go ahead and add another string, which will be user ID. So that it can, I'm going to use an example of a social media application. So we'll have users post and comments at a very rudimentary level. Copy this one more time, add my last entity here. This will be comment. It'll have content. It'll have created on. It'll have user ID. I'm going to change this one right here to post ID, because a comment is related to a post and a user. So as you can see here, it's just a JSON object. It's just basically describing the structure of my my project. It's not a lot of code. It's pretty straightforward. You can look at it and see what you're going to get out of it. So now, so I'm already in that directory. I can go ahead and run. I'm going to move this over to the side so you guys can see. I can run archgen mean TS, because this is the name of the tool that I'm showing you, and then the second or the first parameter is the first argument is the name of the archetype you want to run your descriptor.json against. So you have to be in the same directory that your descriptor.json exists, and then you can run the command. So if I run that, it printed out a lot of stuff there, and then over here you can see a bunch of stuff showed up. So if I go in there, take a look at it, I've got my API. So I've got a comment API here, and you can see there's going to be some red underline right now. But it went ahead and it created all this code for that. It also created it for post and for users. But each one's different. If I come back and look at this, if we look at comments, you see how this says comment.userid, comment.createdOn, post ID, content. Now if I go to user, it just has the two for has the password and the username. So it creates a different file for each one. It created a model for each one. You can see everything in the model, which is essentially like a class or an entity. I don't want that open. This one even creates a bunch of the front end. So if I open up my services, this is all in Angular 1.6. It creates a service specific to each one with your API path there. So you can see how that saves, and this works right out of the box. I can show you. So if I go ahead, I have to run, I'm going to go ahead and run npm install to install the dependencies for this one. And then Bower install, and then I have to run a TypeScript build since this is TypeScript. Each archetype is specific. It will have its own things you have to run. I've got some Java ones where you have to run a Maven clean install because that's just how you build the project once it's ready. So each one's a little different. Oops, spelled that wrong. And on my TypeScript build right here. So now if I go into, let's see, where my services go? Got my comment service right here, which is at API/comments. So I'm going to go ahead and start this running. npm start. Got my connection established. I can go ahead and open this up and move this out of the way so I can see. It's not happening. I guess I'll just use this one. Go to localhost 3000. There we go. So that's the what comes with that archetype. Actually, I don't know why I opened that up. I need to be in here. So I'll go ahead and go to comments. Using Postman, if you guys haven't seen this tool, I would highly suggest you look it up. It's a Chrome application. So I've got localhost API comments. I can go ahead and send a GET request there, and I get square brackets back, which is a good thing. That means I've got an array back. The connection, it was successful, got 200 OK back, so that's good. So if I want to, let's go ahead and let's go to users and create a new user. So if I send a GET request right now to users, I get two that I was messing around with earlier today. So let's go ahead and create a new one based on what's running right now. Go to the body. We've got user name lowercase. We'll call this Tommy 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9. Send that request. I get that back. If I send my GET request back to users again, you can see that Tommy was added. So essentially this code is working, and that data flow was set up based on just Archgen generating that code based on the descriptor that we created there. So that's essentially how you use it if you just want to create a project based off of or generate code based off of an already existing archetype. So what happens there is the descriptor file, the descriptor.json file, is where you describe it. It will then take each of those, run it against whichever archetype you've chosen, and based on what's in that archetype, it will generate code based on your descriptor file. So are there any questions on that, like how that part of it works, We're going to cover more how to create your own custom archetypes here in just a minute. But before we get there, I want to make sure everyone's cool with how to generate code using Archgen.
So the archetypes are those. Where do those come from? Where do they exist?
Good question. So the archetypes, they're just files, and they're a template that when you run it, the descriptor against it, it will take that template and interpolate the code into it that needs to be there. They exist because I've created them. You have to create them. So you can use pre-existing ones, or you can create your own custom ones. I mentioned earlier, this is an open source project. Feel free to open a pull request against it, get some, put it on your resume that you're contributing to open source. That can be code changes for new features. That can be a custom archetype if you want to create that. And I can show you right here. If I go into here, and then I go into bin, and then archetypes. So here are the archetypes that are there right now. I've got MeanTS. I've got a Java full stack one that comes with authentication. I've got a MySQL mean stack. And then I've got a Java NoBack, which is just for kind of messing around with. So you can create your own and install them locally and use them, or you can contribute here. My hope is that in the near future, we will build a repository, a site to host archetypes at, and then people can create their own, and kind of like GitHub or NPM, you could publish your own archetypes, and then people can run Archgen install name of the archetype. So that's a goal that I'd like to get to with this. Good question. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Hey, Nick.
Yes.
What were you thinking when you were going into the naming on your JSON? I notice you have name a number of places, but you have entities, you have properties, you have type. It just seems to me that type obviously means it is a singular value, whether it's a string or whatever it is. But it sounds like, I'm not sure why we need separate names for entities as opposed to props. They seem to be basically doing a lot of the same things. Okay. What was your thinking? What was your thought process on that?
So an entity, if you're thinking like C# or Java or really any programming language, an entity can be mapped directly to a class. A prop is like a property on a class or a field on a class. So you have multiple entities, and for each entity, it's going to create that full data flow. But for each entity, you need different props that describe that entity. It's not just a name. So it's just like having a class called user, and it's going to have properties with username of type string, password of type string. So that's the relationship right there.
But you can probably have properties within properties within properties and properties, right? Nothing really actually stops us for putting objects or entities within as part of a property, right?
So speaking strictly to JSON, yeah, nothing's going to stop you from putting that in there. But the way that most of these work in generating the code, you'll want to have your entities, and each entity will have a prop. The way it generates code, and that's just that's the way a lot of these requests work. The data flow is made up of entities, and the entities have it's like a request and a response. So I don't know if I'm.
Yeah. So
question.
Are you saying you can't have entities in entities? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, you could reference another entity depending on the archetype. So if I had an entity called user, and then I wanted something else to have a prop that was of type user, I could specify that. And then you'd probably, depending on how the archetype was built, if it was built the right way, it would run out of the box. Like you could just build it and run it. If not, you might just have to use primitive data types or classes that come with whichever library you're using or language you're using. But say I wanted to use the user example. I created a user entity, and then in something else I had a prop of type user. I may have to go in and just import that real quick, or add the using statement if you're using C#. Does that kind of answer your question? You can have properties that are the type of a different entity, just like any class.
Well, you mean entity, a reference to an entity. You're not saying that I can have entities within entities. You're saying I can have references to entities within
Right.
entities.
You cannot have entities within entities. Correct.
All right, thank you.
Yep. All right, any other questions before we move on to creating our own custom archetypes? Yes.
One more. I assume that there's some limitations on the language. There's some prescriptions for the wording and certain acceptable usage for variable names, things like that, or variable types. Do you have any feedback if there are errors interpreting the file?
So right now there are a few explicit error messages, thanks to Frank. Before, the error handling wasn't that great. I wrote this tool because I used it, I needed something, and if there was an error I ran into, I could figure it out. I published it to NPM, and I got a bunch of downloads on it, and when that happened, I was like, oh, I should add some documentation to this. So I spent a few hours and put together some decent documentation. There's definitely better, but it's decent enough that you can read through it and get a handle of what it is. And then error handling is something else that I would like to improve on that as far as the messages. So ideas for open source contributions. If you find an error and you figure out what it is and you want to add more explicit error handling so the next person running into that will get a clearer message, that's a good idea. Good question.
Hey, Nick, also
Yes.
Your connection, that's to a local database?
No, that's to a database that's connected. It's hosted on MLab right now. So that's just a connection string. That can be to a local database. It can be to a remote database. It can be to any database that you have the credentials to log in for or the connection string to.
Okay. Would that also be a database I have on a cloud?
Yes.
Do I have to have a URL?
You have to have the connection string to the database. So if whatever that is, whatever cloud hosting system you're using, whether that's Azure, AWS, Heroku, somewhere in there in the database that you have hosted, you'll be able to find what the connection string is to that. If you look at this connection string here, if I can find where to pull that up at, where did that go? Descriptor. This connection string has the host, it has my username and password, and then I guess that's more the host right there, and then the database name. So each connection string is built up a little differently, but it's not just the URL. It's not just the URL to the database, it's the connection string. It contains more than just the address.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And for each archetype, it would be different. This one is a mean stack, so this is pointing to a Mongo database. If you try to connect it to a relational database, it's not going to work. So each archetype is different, which is why there are different archetypes that work for different things, and you're able to create custom ones to fit your needs. All right. So let's move on to building our own custom archetype. This is where you'll start to see more behind the scenes how it works, which is the fun stuff. So to start, and let me go down here. So there's two types of template files. When you build an archetype, and actually let me show you this real quick. Here's an archetype right here. All it is a handful of text files. Extension, txt, and a README file. The README file is just for documentation to tell people how to use your archetype and what properties it needs in the descriptor.json. But the files that make up the template, there are two types of template files. There are static files and entity files. A static file, what that means, it's not truly static, as in it just creates it word for word what it is. That does the basic interpolation that something like the Yeoman generator does. It basically just switches out a few variables. And I can show you an example here, this POM XML. Well, actually, that's not a good example, but that is one. this one, this app.txt right here, it just basically will create one instance of this file. When you run it against this Java no back archetype, you will only end up with one application.java file. And that's what static means, is it essentially only creates one of those. Now, an entity file template, or entity template file, will create one of that file for each entity. So if I go into this controller right here, actually let's take a look at the mean TS since we're already using that. Let me go into mean TS and I'll open up the model. So inside the mean TS, this at the very top, the first line, has a for entity tag right here. And notice the syntax of this. I had to choose something that was unique so it wouldn't conflict with other frameworks or templating frameworks. So I did the diamond brackets, underscore, and then the tag name. So in the first file I showed you, the static one, the very first line was the URL, the relative URL, where that file would be created at when you run Archgen. If that is not the first line and there's a for entity tag on the first line, that will mark it as an entity template file. The entity template files, like I said, get created one for each entity described in your JSON descriptor. The second line then becomes the URL. Now, anywhere you see the diamond bracket underscore, that is going to be read. It's going to either be a command like a loop or something, or a variable in your descriptor file. So this one says entity.name. Now I can refer to entity inside of this file because it's a for entity file. If it was not a for entity file, I couldn't refer to entity because entity would not exist in that context, right? So this is going to say entity.name, and then we added a .ts to the end. So for each entity, I've got, in the example we just ran, I had user, post, and comment. It will create a file at models/user.ts, comment.ts, post.ts. So that will get interpolated right there. And then you just have the code you want it to. Anything that's just regular text will show up as regular text. Now we get down to here. Actually, we'll start right here. We got export interface, and I've got entity.name. So that's the name property on the entity from our descriptor.json file. And then if you add a colon right there, you can use methods. So right now, first cap is the only method that I've needed to implement. But what that does is it capitalizes the first letter of the variable that's going to be interpolated there. Now you can imagine why that's useful. A lot of times you need to capitalize or camel case, Pascal case, something. So this gets used a lot. Now I've got this for prop loop. Who can take a guess at what that does?
Creates a section of the file that's repeated for every property that was listed in your descriptor.
Perfect. Every property in that specific entity for that descriptor. So anything between this for prop and this end for prop will be repeated for each property in that entity. So right here, this is going to be the property name and the property type. And so it will, if you have 1,000 properties on that, it will repeat that code 1,000 times. That's a one-liner, so it's pretty easy, but that can be as long as you want it. The next thing to take note of is at this time, the for prop and the for entity tags have to be all the way over, no indentation. They have to be to the left. That will change at some point. There's been no need at this point to change it. But if you run into an error and it's not working because you have this tabbed over, just make sure you get rid of those tabs or spaces there. This is useful, and we'll actually get into an example of how I go about creating archetypes. But the for prop is super useful for creating like getters and setters in different languages. or methods that you have to have for each property, because you can just add the for prop there, write the method, extract the name and put in the prop.name there and create it. You also, so for entity can be used to define an entity template file. It can also be used inside of a static file, just like the for prop, to create an entity loop. For example, let me show you this one. I've got index.ejs here. So I've got a for entity loop here, and then end for entity. So these two lines are going to basically connect to the entity.name controller for each entity that was created. So you can use a for entity loop to do something for each entity. Any questions so far? All right. So how do you create an archetype? Like, what is the process? What goes through your mind in order to create an archetype? The way I've approached it is usually when you build projects, you have a pattern that you follow. You create your controllers a certain way. You create your service layer a certain way, your data access layer a certain way. Everything in your data flow from the front end to the back end to the database and back, you generally have a pattern for that. So to create an archetype, you would take that pattern and so say I wrote it for something like I've got my pizza entity. I wrote the pattern for my pizza entity. I would go through and I would take that code. It's already working code. I would remove pizza everywhere in there. I would extrapolate that pattern, and then I'd start to replace it with the tags necessary to interpolate the correct stuff there when a descriptor is ran against it. So for example, if I have this Java program right here, you go ahead and open up Pokemon in this example. Let's look at my entity. So I've got an entity right here. So I would have an already working version of the project, and I'm like, I don't want to have to write that code again. Next time I create a project, I don't want to go through that again. So I would take this, I would copy it, and I would create a new project in here, terminate that, create my archetype, cd into that, and I'm going to go ahead and exit out this one for now. So I'm going to create an archetype. So create a new file. You can follow whatever convention you want. There's no rules to this, but what I like to do is I like to call it the name of the file that it would create. So in this instance, it was an entity, right? So I'm going to call this entity.txt, something like that, or entity java.txt, whatever, txt. They're all text files. So I've got that. Then I go ahead and paste it in here. Now, if it is a static file, I can just go ahead and put the path that I want it to be at relative to the project up here, and that's where it will create that file. But if it's an entity file, which this one is, obviously because this one's titled entity, so I'm going to create an entity for each entity in my descriptor. Then I want to include my my for entity loop up here. So for entity. Then on the second line, I can create my my URL. Where is it? What's the path for it? So I would go and I would look at this, and I see this is inside of source, and it actually, this doesn't show it the right way, but it's source, com, entities, and then the entity name. So I could go back here. Let me remember that. Source, com, entities, entity name. And I'd add src, com, entities, and then the entity name. Well, I want the entity name, so I'm going to say entity.name, and I want it to be capitalized first, just because that's the pattern I was using there. So I do colon, first caps. Yep. There we go. And then I would add .java at the end. So basically this will just get interpolated for whatever the name of the entity is, .java, it will create that file there. The next thing I would do is I would go through and I would extract anything that was specific to that application and write the code that needs to go there. So here, Pokemon, it's capitalized, so I'm going to replace that with entity.name first cap. So now I know that every time this file gets generated, the class is going to be the name of that entity. Now here, let's say in this example, I want every entity to have an ID that's an integer. So I could leave that there. That's static. It'll stay the same for everything. That's good. But every entity is not going to have a name and a type. So I need to come here and replace this. So this will be a for props. I don't remember if that's plural or pretty sure it's double check. Controllers, therefore, nope. Where's the right one? Models. Yeah, for prop, singular. So for prop, go ahead down here. And I remember when I chose that, I went with the singular one because it's for prop, like for each prop instead of for props. And then end for prop. So anytime I have a for prop or for entity loop, you have to end it. The only time you don't end it is if you have it at the top of the file and it's a entity file. You don't have to end that one at the bottom of the file. That will just be created for each entity. So now I change this. Public is going to be the same there. This is going to be different. That's going to be the type. So here I would go ahead and I'd add prop.type. And you can call these whatever you want. Like if you have something else, this is just type and name. If you had something else you need to add, you could add that. And then best practice would be in your README to include that so people know when they're using your archetype that, hey, each prop actually has this third thing as well. So you're not limited to what you can put there. And then this would be the name of it. So score prop.name. There we go. And this would just be deleted. Did you say something?
Would they have a first cap for it?
On
With the prop.name you just wrote?
no. So for this one, if I go back real quick, see how that these two are lowercase?
Oh yeah.
Now this is kind of confusing because this is name and this is type. That's just because the Pokemon has a name and a type. And we're using name and type. So that has nothing to do with this. That could be our username and password. That's what I would be removing right there. So now I've got this line. I don't need this line anymore because it will be created for each prop. So I can remove that. So here's an example where I have getters and setters. So I have to get the ID and set the ID. I'm going to go ahead and leave those ones static because the ID is static. If you weren't going to have that, you wouldn't need to leave those. But this right here, get name and set name, those aren't going to be static. Those are going to be, I need that for each prop. So I'm going to go ahead and add another for prop here. And end that right here. I can go ahead and delete these two because those will be created inside my for prop. And then I just do the same thing. I start extrapolating what needs to come out of there. So my type, that needs to come out of there. So that'll just be prop.type. And get name. For Java conventions, Java being conventions, get is going to stay there. I need name to be removed, and that's going to be the name of my prop. So I'll go ahead and add prop.name. And now this one's going to be capitalized because I want to use camel case there. So that's a big example of where it's super useful. And then it's going to return prop.name. And so the return type is gone. Type's good. Okay, so here we'll come back to our setter. Void's good. I need to leave set. I need to put the name there. A lot of times I'll have this one just kind of copied and pasted. Paste that. This is type, so we're going to say prop.type, and we're going to paste that one and remove first cap because it's not going to be first cap. And scroll back over. And then we're going to set this dot prop name equal to prop name. So that method will get created, like I've said many times here, for each property. So I would go ahead and now I've got my entity level entity template file that will be created for each template for each entity in the descriptor. I would go back through my code of my already existing file, and I would grab everything relevant to the project that needs to be generated when I generate it again, and I would do the same thing. So I'd go to this service. Well, this one's obviously entity level specific. I'd create an entity level file for that. I go into here, application. This has nothing to do with any specific entity. This is bootstrapping the application so that it'll run. So I would just create a static file for this. So I'm going to go ahead and do that so you can see an example of both. Create a new file. I'll just call this app.txt. Paste everything in there. These ones are the easiest because you don't have to change anything unless there is stuff in there you have to change. But I just put this at the top. So this is going to be what? Source src / I don't need any special interpolation there. Application.java. There you go. So we can pretend that I went through and I did the rest of the files there. It would be the same thing you'd be watching over again, so no need to do that. This is my archetype. Now, if I want to test this myself, I have to put it in the path with all the archetypes. So for if you're on Windows, that path is it's where your on any environment, it's where your node modules are installed at. On Windows, that's in app data. So if I go to app data, and then I go into npm, node modules, archgen, bin, archetypes. So if I take this folder I created and put in here, then I'll be able to run it. So I'll show you. Let's go ahead and open that up. Where is that at? Projects, Archgen demo, my archetype. Okay. Let's open it from here. Open new window. I'm missing that. There it is. Projects. Archgen demo, my archetype. So I'm going to go ahead and move this over into my Archgen installation. Can't be because because I'm using it still. Okay. So let's go ahead and exit out of this. Now drag it over there. It can be completed because this folder or a file in it is opened by another program.
You must have been editing it recently.
Hmm.
Or it doesn't have CDs to it.
Oh yeah, let me get out of that and see what happens.
I bet you there's one file open in the editor somewhere.
There we go. That's because I was in it. Yeah. All right. So it's called my archetype right there. So now if I wanted to run it, I would go ahead and let's go ahead and create I'm going to call this one test 3. CD into test 3. Open this one up in VS Code. And what do I have to do now if I want to use that archetype? Good, I have to create a descriptor.json. So in that one, when I created it, I didn't use a name anywhere, like a project name. Or actually, let me. No, I don't have that open anymore. I think I did, but I didn't do it. So I just did source. Yep, I didn't use a project name in that one. That one doesn't need it. So I don't have to have a name inside of my descriptor.json. if you needed the project name somewhere in the archetype you created and you used it, then you would have the name here. Now that's the thing. If you create an archetype and it asks for a variable, that variable has to be defined in this descriptor.json, or you're going to get an undefined exception. So this one just needs entities, all it needs, and you can define any variables you want. So anywhere when you're creating your archetype, if you say diamond brackets underscore cookie, that variable has to be declared in your descriptor.json to use that, which is a good reason to put that in the README. Otherwise, if anyone else is using your archetype, they're not going to know until they hit every single undefined and figure it out for themselves. That's why the READMEs are very nice. So entities, let's go ahead. Let's just use the same descriptor that we had in the last one. See what this does for us. So cd into test 2. Open that one up. Let's grab these entities. So I'm just gonna grab all of that. Yeah, I'll post it. All right, I've got that. I'll post these in here. So I did have entities. Each one had props and names. Each one had the name and the type. So that should be good. So if I save that, and then come into here, cd back into the one I wanted to be in, so test 3. Now I can run archgen my archetype. Run it. Did that. What did I get? Got some undefined stuff, so what was it?
Did you originally spell with an E at the end after the H?
Yeah, because I got these. So let's see. I like to look through it.
It's called prop instead of props. So just change your.
Oh, did I put something wrong in there?
You can just change your descriptor to be prop instead of prop.
Oh, gotcha. So I got to go back to my descriptor.
Singular.
I called each one prop instead of props. And I did that at the archetype level. So let's go ahead and just run it again. Cannot read entity.props.
So you run it again, is it going to like overwrite those files, or is it going to make?
Yeah, it would just overwrite them. I actually need to go back and change it to props in here in the archetype. So we'll do that real quick. Where do I have the archetype open? You just go into here and open this one up. Put prop in for prop. Into undefined. Right there. So let me check this real quick to make sure it's for prop and for prop. I got undefined there. All right. I got for prop, I've got an N for prop. And that one worked. What did I do wrong here?
If you have proper capitalization, it's hard to see from that there.
It looks like it. May have missed something. Either way, I'll look at that later and see if there's a bug that I can fix on that. But you can see what it does here, and it printed those out. That's going to bug me now, but I'll look into that later so that doesn't waste everyone else's time. But it created, you can see it created one of each of them, and then it created only one of the application, and it put them in the directories that I told it to put them in. So that's a small example. If you have a larger project and there's more files for each entity, you have that whole data flow, and you extrapolate that pattern, and you create an archetype to match that pattern. You can then reuse that over and over again. All you have to do is write a small descriptor file, and that will write all that code for you instead of doing that boilerplate work or copy and pasting, because when you copy and paste, you make mistakes. So this makes it a lot easier. So are there any questions?
Hey, Nick.
Yes.
When you were talking about having that full stack, full CRUD template, I guess your first demonstration, when you're talking about full stack, does that generate the HTML and CSS files from the front end?
So the mean TS one, it does generate some HTML, because remember when you saw me open it up and I went back and forth between those two pages, it also creates a lot of the front end Angular portion of that, just the boilerplate work. Oh, and that actually brings up a good, you can make it create whatever you want, and it can be in whatever language you want. It's just a giant string builder in essence. It creates a big string and it outputs it to the type of file you want. So you can have it create HTML, CSS, whatever you want. You can have it create recipes if you want to. I mean, it can.
Okay. So understanding or using Postman is optional.
Yes, I used Postman to demonstrate that it generated a API that worked out of the box, connected to the database, and that full data flow was intact. Something I want to point out about this is in development, there's, and there might be more parts, but when I look at it, I think of two main parts. There's all the, I call it boilerplate code. It's a pattern. You write it over and over again. You create a class or an entity, a controller. You write that same code over and over again. It's a pattern. And then there's business logic. Business logic is it's defined. It tells the application what to do. You know, if the date is between this date and this date, and they buy 3 gallons of milk, give them a discount. You cannot automatically generate that code because that's defined somewhere by the business. So what this does is it takes away all the boilerplate code, all the monotony of rewriting the same thing over and over again, and allows you to focus on the logic and honestly the more fun parts of programming. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. If you have any questions in the future, feel free to reach out to me, email, Slack. And if you want to contribute, you can open a pull request. If you don't know what to contribute to and you want to, you can ask me and we can think of some things. I want to add some better error handling. There are new features that I want to add. Like I said, eventually I want it to be able so you can run Archgen install the name of the archetype and you can pull that down. I'm working on implementing a default feature which will allow you to run Archgen default the name, or Archgen the name of the archetype default, and it will generate a default one so you don't have to write a descriptor for it, so you can just see kind of what comes with each archetype. So there are other features if you use this and you find bugs and you want to commit or open a pull request for bug fix, that's awesome. If you come up with ideas for new features, if you're using it, you're like, this is really cool, I really wish it did this, adding in some more logical tags, anything like that, let me know and we'll get you contributing. I really believe this can help everyone in here or at your job. If you're asked to write a bunch of stuff, you have a tool that helps you out there. So have fun with it. Thanks, everybody.